Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty fundamental today. We all want to figure out how to live a life that's full of joy,
Mhm.
like not just fleeting moments of happiness, but something deeper, more consistent. And I think a lot of us are kind of searching for that.
Definitely. And what's interesting is often when we think about happiness or joy, we might jump to like positive thinking or maybe trying to surround ourselves with good experiences. But this source, Gita for Joyful Living, it takes a bit of a different approach, a more foundational approach, you could say.
Right. And that's what we're going to be digging into today, specifically verses 25 through 31 of chapter 4. Think of this as the prep work, before we can even start building that joyful life.
Yeah, it's like laying the foundation.
Yeah.
And the core idea that this section tackles is it's actually about our relationship with the world around us, with all the things that we experience through our senses.
So, like the sights and sounds and tastes, all that stuff.
Exactly. The text acknowledges that, we naturally enjoy those things. That's part of being human. The problem, the source suggests, is when we become attached to those sensory experiences,
Right.
when we start to depend on them for our happiness and we start to fear losing them.
Okay, so it's not about never enjoying a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal. It's more about recognizing when that enjoyment turns into this, like, need. When we
Mhm.
start to feel like we can't be happy without those things.
Exactly. And that's where the suffering comes in, according to this text. When we cling to these external things for our well-being, we kind of set ourselves up for disappointment because, well, everything changes, right?
Right. So if our happiness is totally dependent on things outside ourselves, it's always going to be like up and down.
That's the idea. And the solution the source proposes at this stage is really interesting. It uses the analogy of immunization.
Oh, like getting a vaccine.
Precisely. Think about it. A vaccine might cause some discomfort in the short term, but in the long run, it protects us from something far worse.
So, in this context, the illness, so to speak, is that attachment to sensory pleasures. And the immunization is about consciously choosing to step back from that constant indulgence. It's not about denying ourselves everything, but more about building a kind of resistance.
Yes. It's like building up our strength so we're not so easily swayed by those cravings, so we can still enjoy the world around us, but without that dependence that leads to suffering.
Okay, so how do we actually immunize ourselves against this attachment? What does that look like in practice?
Well, the source gives a few examples. It talks about the Muslim practice of fasting during Ramadan, where they abstain from food and drink from dawn till dusk for an entire month.
Oh, right.
And it mentions the Hindu tradition of abstaining from certain sensory enjoyments for a period of time before visiting the Yapan temple. These were both instances of like deliberately choosing to limit sensory input.
So it's not about never experiencing those things, but more about setting aside specific times or engaging in certain practices where we're consciously managing our desires, not letting them totally run the show.
Yes. And the source also brings up practices like pranayama. You heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
It involves regulating the breath. And japa, which is the repetition of specific sounds or mantras. And of course, yoga and meditation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those, but it seems like those practices are coming from different traditions, different belief systems even.
That's true. But the source suggests that at their core, all of these disciplines, whether someone is fully aware of it or not, they're all contributing to this process of cultivating a mind that's not constantly ruled by those sensory cravings.
It's almost like we're training our minds, right? Like building up that mental muscle so that we have more control over how we respond to things.
Absolutely. And what the source says about the result of these practices is pretty fascinating. It says that by willfully abstaining from sense objects, we actually end up strengthening our sense organs.
Really? You'd think it would be the opposite. Like, if we're not using our senses as much, they would get weaker.
That's what you might think. But the text argues that by not constantly bombarding ourselves with stimulation and not immediately giving in to every craving, we're actually allowing our senses to become more refined, more sensitive, less clouded by that constant need for more, more, more.
Interesting. So it's kind of like by creating some space, some distance from those sensory experiences, we're actually able to experience them more fully, more clearly.
That's the idea. And on the flip side, the source suggests that if we don't engage in these practices, if we just keep indulging every desire, then our attachment to those sense objects just gets stronger and stronger. And that actually makes it harder to find true, lasting joy.
Okay. That makes sense. So it's all about balance and having some control over sensory experiences. And this brings us to the importance of mental maturity, right? Because the source is very clear that consistent effort in these self-imposed restraints is crucial for developing the level of mental maturity needed for the next stage of this path.
Yeah, this first phase, all this action, all this self-discipline, it's like a prerequisite. The source is saying you can't just jump to the end goal without this foundation.
And this deep dive is really focused on this first step, the action part. Because as the source explicitly states, without engaging in these actions, it's impossible to move on to the second and final part of the path, which is gaining knowledge.
And that second part, the knowledge part, that's where the deeper realization of joy comes in. It's about understanding who we truly are.
Hmm.
But the source is saying we can't fully grasp that until we've done the groundwork, until we've built that foundation through action.
So we do these practices, we build up that mental discipline, and then what? Do we keep doing them forever?
That's a great question. And according to the source, the answer is actually no. Once we've reached a certain level of mental maturity, once we're ready, then it's time to shift our focus, to let go of those initial actions and fully dedicate ourselves to gaining self-knowledge.
So those actions, those practices, they're like a stepping stone.
Exactly. They're not the destination. They're the way to get there. And the source uses this really powerful analogy to explain it, the analogy of the pole vaulter.
Oh, I like that.
So the pole vaulter uses the pole to gain momentum, to reach a certain height, but to clear the bar, to actually succeed, they have to let go of the pole at just the right moment. Holding on would actually prevent them from reaching their goal.
So those initial actions, they're like the pole. They get us to a certain point, but then we have to let go and make that final leap. And that final leap is gaining knowledge.
Exactly. And the source also addresses a potential misunderstanding. It points out that some people might think that simply continuing those initial practices, like just doing more and more of them, will eventually lead to that ultimate joy. But the text suggests that actually, no. At that point, it becomes a hindrance. It's like you've reached the top of the pole, but you're still clinging to it, so you can't make that final jump.
I see. So it's not just about doing any action. It's about doing the right action at the right time and then being willing to let go and move on when it's time.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing when one stage has served its purpose and it's time to move on to the next.
Now, the source also goes into some detail about different types of actions or sacrifices, as it calls them. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Sure. Verses 25 through 29 of chapter 4 outline these different forms of action. It talks about people who worship different deities through various offerings, like different forms of sacrifice.
Okay.
And then it mentions those who offer their actions and perceptions into the fire of the Supreme Brahman. Essentially, what that means is they're seeing the interconnectedness of everything and dedicating their actions with that understanding.
So it's not just about the outward action, it's about the intention behind it.
Exactly. And then there are those who offer their senses and the objects of those senses, things like sight and sound, into the fire of a controlled mind. This is again about like mastering those sensory impulses.
So it's about being conscious of what we're taking in through our senses and how we're responding to it.
Yes. And for those who are really focused on self-realization, the source talks about offering all the functions of the senses and even the breath into the fire of a controlled mind. This is presented as a more intense practice aimed at, like, stilling the mind and the senses.
Wow, okay. And it sounds like there are even more types of sacrifices mentioned.
Oh, definitely. The source also talks about people who give up material possessions through acts of austerity, those who take strict vows, and those who practice the 8 limbs of yoga. And even something like studying sacred texts for the purpose of gaining knowledge, that's considered a form of sacrifice too. It's an action directed towards a higher understanding.
So sacrifice in this context isn't just about giving something up. It's more about dedicating yourself, your efforts, your energy towards a particular aim. And that often involves self-discipline and focused intention.
Precisely. It's a really broad concept. And it even includes things like consciously regulating your breath or moderating your eating habits as a form of discipline.
So many different forms, but all with that common thread of moving beyond the immediate gratification of the senses and the ego.
Yes. That's a really insightful observation. And the source then goes on to talk about what happens when we engage in these sacrifices with understanding. It says that those who grasp the deeper meaning behind these actions, they become cleansed of negative tendencies, and they reach a higher state of being.
So again, the intention matters. It's not just about going through the motions.
Exactly. And to really drive this point home, the source ends this section with a powerful statement. Verse 31 says, O Arjuna, without sacrifice, one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What then of the next? Is a pretty strong assertion that action, this initial step, is absolutely essential for any possibility of joyful living, both in the here and now and in the future.
Powerful stuff. Okay, so to recap what we've covered in this deep dive, the main takeaway is that action, especially in the form of self-restraint and various discipline practices, is presented as the crucial first step on the path towards living a more joyful life. And it's not about denying ourselves pleasure, but rather about lessening our dependence on those external things and developing the mental clarity and strength we need to move on to the next stage.
Exactly. By engaging in these practices, by immunizing ourselves against attachment, we build up our capacity to experience the world without being constantly pulled this way and that by our desires and fears. And this lays the groundwork, the foundation for that second and final step.
And that second step, which we'll explore in our next deep dive, is all about gaining knowledge, specifically understanding who we truly are. And that knowledge, that self-knowledge, is what ultimately leads to that lasting joy, that instant joyful living that we're all seeking.
That's right. So as you go about your day, maybe think about the ways in which you already engage in acts of self-restraint or discipline. Maybe you have certain practices or routines that you follow. Even if you haven't thought of them in this context before, could they be subtly strengthening your ability to experience the world without that constant need for attachment? Could they be preparing you, in a way, for that deeper understanding of yourself and the joy that's already within you?
Lots to ponder as always. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for the second and final step on this path to joyful living.
Looking forward to it.